Good morning, dear friends. It's good to see all of you. Good to see your names trickling into the chat box, and happy that we are together for the 4th day in a row. I'm pleased to share with you that I have been sharing with our principal in charge, Dr. Vadlakshmi, updates on each day's lecture and the videos as well. And she has commended the work that we are doing. And I thank Madam for encouraging us. I also thank my colleagues at the Department of English, Queen Mary's College, for standing by me, for working together as a team and taking this webinar series forward. So I warmly welcome you, dear participants. And we are already acquainted with some of you because you've been keeping in touch with us and asking for clarifications. So we got to know some of you through that. In the feedback you have given so far, many of you requested us to conduct similar webinars in the future. So we are happy to hear that, and we will certainly oblige your request and take it very seriously. And we will keep in touch with you regarding future programs. Because as you know, all this is only for the expansion of knowledge, and whatever we are doing is towards creating a knowledge society. And as Dr. Ganesh was saying yesterday, all knowledge is transcendent. So we are doing our little bit in that endeavor. So your appreciation and support means a lot to us, and we will try to organize programs in keeping with your interests. Some of you might be wondering how we hit upon this topic, literature in times like these, and why we are doing this kind of reaching out to people. Well, that is very much a part of Queen Mary's culture, and it is also from our history that we get that approach. The fervor to empower through education is so intricately woven into the fabric of Queen Mary's College that it is almost synonymous with the institution. So for the past 3 days, we were alluding to Queen Mary's glorious past. The glory of the past rests on the fact that Queen Mary was a pioneer in education for women. So if one were to speak in terms of Eliot's tradition and the individual talent and the pastness of the past and its presence, terms which we are generously borrowing from your great poet, Queen Mary's College is definitely an epitome of the ideal that he has set forth. Well, paradigm shifts have taken place, especially with regard to the demography of the college. So if you look at the alumni of the college, you will find that many of them are from affluent, erudite, illustrious families. But Queen Mary's College has always been a government college and always been secular, so always been inclusive. But definitely over the years, more people have been included. So the vision with which the college was started continues to guide the affairs of the college. In relation to this, I would like to draw on a quote from the coffee table edition prepared for the college centenary. The last chapter of this book is titled QMC Today, an Egalitarian Centenarian. I quote, Queen Mary's College has, from the time of its inception, reached out to women of all sections of society. Some, I emphasize some, of elite families in the city sent their daughters to study here. One can only visualize how they must have come to college. 100 years ago, they must have arrived in family-owned jatkas, further down the line in imported British cars, and later in the indigenously made ambassador. The students of today have the privilege of being dropped right inside the campus, unquote. Well, this article states that in 1986, the then Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, Dr. M.G. Ramachandran, on his return from Secretariat, his convoy was going on the beach road on his way back from Secretariat. He saw girls standing in the sweltering heat, waiting for buses. And then it occurred to him that transport services, public transport services could be arranged for the students of Queen Mary's. And so immediately, with immediate effect, public transport was arranged for the students to be dropped off in the morning and picked up after college. So QMC was a drop-off point in the morning and a pickup point in the evenings, and that continues even till today. So we're very happy that our girls have this privilege, and they are really queens of Queen Mary's. So I continue from this article, I quote, one might attribute the paradigm shift in the student population of QMC to Periyaarism and the DK movement. Another important factor is the introduction of Tamil medium. It's an option for students, and Tamil medium was introduced in 1969. The policy of inclusiveness strictly adhered to at the time of admission, with seats being filled only as per quota, ensures that the ideal of giving equal opportunity to the disadvantaged is followed, unquote. I would like to invoke at this stage the mission statement of the college. The mission statement states, as educating a woman is tantamount to educating a family, the mission of the college is to have programs that ensure all-round development of its students. The goal in view is an education that transforms young women and equips them to face challenges in their personal and professional lives. The college endeavors to maintain a learning atmosphere that reinforces the ideals of professional competence and social commitment. I'm happy to share with you that in the recent NIRF rankings, Queen Mary's College is ranked 41. The strength on which we have gained this ranking is our placement cell, the outcome, the graduate outcome, which is the result, and our faculty-student ratio. So we are very proud of our placement team, we are proud of our NIRF team, and we are proud of Queen Mary's College. In the last NAC accreditation, the college secured an A grade. Well, a good leader takes everyone with him or her. In that sense, Queen Mary's College is a true leader in the field of education, with its mission to the cause of women's education and its social mandate of reaching the unreached. I would like to wrap up this piece on QMC's contemporary history with a quote from the egalitarian centenarian. Are egalitarianism and excellence incompatible goals? No. It often seems as if the two ideals, equal opportunity and excellence, are irreconcilable. However, education is one of the instruments through which most societies in the world strive for social equality, or at least attempt to reduce social inequalities amongst and between their members. This is because only education can foster the upward mobility of the downtrodden and bring them into the mainstream. And this is how you bring into the mainstream those who live on the fringes of society. Widening access to education is indeed a strategy that works in the long run. Queen Mary's, the egalitarian centenarian, has demonstrated that it is possible to straddle two horses, equal opportunity and excellence. Today, the socialist perspective on the history of Queen Mary's College, the slant that I've given today to um, a snippet about the college, this emphasis has been there because our topic for today relates to one section of the victims of COVID-19. I'm not referring to those infected. I'm referring to those disenfranchised and displaced by the economic ramifications of the lockdown. Our resource person for today, Dr. Benet, has graciously consented to address this subject of the displacement of human communities and take us on a literary journey to get to the heart of the matter. And he has titled his presentation, Exodus. Dr. Benet teaches English at National College, Tiruchirappalli, and he has been in this college since 1996. He began his career at Regional Institute of English, Bengaluru, and served as a lecturer for 6 years at Islamia College, Vaniambadi, before migrating to Tiruchirappalli. He has been guiding both MPhil and PhD scholars for many years now. He has presented scholarly papers in more than 50 national and international seminars and conferences. Besides, he has published 18 papers in national and international journals and anthologies. He has 3 books to his credit as well. He continues to be a resource person to the HRDC centers of various universities and has developed more than 500 lectures as invited guest and speaker in many colleges and universities. So you see that he is in great demand and we're lucky to have him. He has helped more than 600 SET-NET JRF aspirants clear the exams through his preparatory and revision classes. So he is very well known in this field of preparing students for UGC and SET-NET. He's a motivational speaker and hopes to train a good number of students and scholars who will one day become creative writers and translators. He says that he is passionate about reading fiction and has a bucket list of Nobel Prize winning novels that he's actually binging on. So welcome, sir, and it's such a delight and pleasure to have you with us. And we really look forward to what you have to share with us today, sir. Over to you, sir.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to meet most of you through this virtual meet, so to speak. And I'm delighted that Queen Mary's College Chennai has arranged for a lecture series, and mine is going to be the 4th of the lecture series. And let me take a minute or two and appreciate Queen Mary's College Chennai. For the last 4 days, we have been listening to a short history of that college and the yeoman service to girl students and the society at large. And let me thank the head of the department, Dr. Maria Preeti Srinivasan, and it was she who contacted me 2 weeks ago and told me about this program. And I immediately agreed, because this is one subject that is very close to my heart. That is movement of people, exodus. So I agreed to give a talk on exodus. And this is going to be a presentation which will be factual. Factual in the sense I'm going to reload a lot of data related to people who keep moving from one place to another. When I read the Hindu a couple of days ago, it stated that 8 crore people have been displaced within our country. And COVID-19 resulted in such internal displacement. As a result, people lost their jobs, they lost their livelihood, and we saw this very, very sad spectacle of people trying to walk back to their villages and hometowns under scorching sun. Now, when we saw this spectacle on television, we were looking at all this in the comfort of our homes, and we were just feeling sorry for these people. But we have to get back to the roots of what we call migration. So let me refresh your memory, let me jog your memory and take you back in time. We have this movement of people across our globe, and this has been happening for thousands of years. This is not a recent phenomenon or a modern day phenomenon, but it has been happening over many centuries. So you have this interesting story in the Bible, which we call the biblical Exodus. Now, what do we find there? We find people moving to Egypt because of famine, especially the people of Israel moving to Egypt because of famine, then returning from Egypt to the land of milk and honey, namely Canaan. Now, this is a story, and in this story from the Bible, we learn how the people of Israel who were under slavery in Egypt, they longed to go back to their native place, namely Canaan, and how it took a leader like Moses to bring them back to Canaan. It's an interesting story. And there are many things which are magical, and there are many things which are what we call supernatural. All those things go to make this biblical story a beautiful one. Like the Red Sea parting, and again, the locusts and other diseases and pestilence attacking the Egyptians and so on. Now, in this story, we find, in this biblical story, it took them nearly 40 years to cross from Egypt to Israel. Today, you can cross the distance in just 40 minutes if you travel by a jet aircraft. But it took them 40 long years to cross from Egypt to Israel. And that's the story in the Bible, because they underwent a lot of trials and tribulations before they reached their dreamland, namely Canaan. This is a story from the Bible. How about movement of people? Now, if those students who are familiar with the history of English literature, you know, uh, the British Isles, as we call it, was almost an empty place, and how the Angles and the Saxons, then the Danes, then the French, how they all migrated to this small island and they created a culture of their own. We know that the Anglo-Saxon invasion, that was also a movement, but they were all violent hordes from Europe. They migrated to England. So it's a long story. Let me cut the story short. And people kept moving, not only people, even animals, birds, and other species. They all keep moving. When we talk about migratory birds, we call that seasonal migration. And it's a round trip. For instance, we have places like Vedandangal here, and there are Point Calimar and many such places in Tamil Nadu, where birds come all the way from Siberia and from Russia. They come here during our winter season and they get back during our summer. So, and people tag these birds just to find out why these birds come here, how long it takes them to travel, and how fast they travel, and how non-stop they travel. It all makes an interesting study in ornithology. And animals also migrate. And we have seen how herds of elephants, they move from one place to another during summer in search of food and water. Now, why do people migrate? And according to one estimate, there are nearly 258 million people who live outside their country. This was a study made in 2017. 258 million people living outside their country. So again, let me jog your memory and about our modern day migration, which all started with the Great Voyages. In 1492, you find a person like Vasco da Gama, and again, a series of adventures like Columbus, Cortes, Bilboa, and many of them. And even 3 centuries later, someone like Captain Cook. And all of them, they started exploring this planet Earth. They discovered this was a beautiful planet, and the shape of the planet is something like an oblong spheroid or oblate spheroid. And if you travel towards the east, you would come towards the west. That is an unassailable truth, a geographical fact which they discovered. Since then, the colonialists, the migrants, they all took to traveling. So in the initial stage, remember a country like America, it was a major colony, a major discovery for the Westerners. Thanks to Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci, this land, an isolated land across the Atlantic, that became a favorite spot for migrants. The events in Europe, for instance, because in Europe there was a religious journey and people chose to migrate. They opted to migrate from Europe, mostly Protestants and Puritans. And we read in the history of English literature, somewhere around 1620, they boarded a ship called Mayflower, and they were the first immigrants to the United States. Now followed by the Puritans, the European Protestants, the French Huguenots, as they were called, the French Protestants. And all these people, they started migrating towards America, which they thought a land of milk and honey, and the New Jerusalem, to use a Christian phrase. So this movement, it went on for a very long time in history. And remember, it was followed by migration of people. This was not a forced migration, rather a voluntary migration. People using their volition, using their will, they chose to migrate and no one could stop them. But something unfortunate happened, which we learn from history. When these people migrated to the United States, what they call the Eastern Board, they went and settled down on the eastern part of the United States of America, what we call New York, Philadelphia, Boston, that region. So then again, within that country, another migration started that was from east to west, from the eastern part of the United States to the western part, to be precise, towards the southwestern part. Now, this was something important. Land was acquired, and the natives were displaced from their own lands because of wars with this migrant population. So I don't have time to recollect all those, but you know this history and how the Europeans migrated to America in huge numbers, and mostly from England, they migrated in large numbers, especially from the northern part of the country, from Northern Ireland. The Protestants, they started migrating in huge numbers. All this happened. You may remember the famine which visits Ireland very often. They always call that potato famine because potato happens to be the staple food of the Irish people. In case the crop fails, they are left with nothing. They have nothing to feed themselves. So they have to necessarily leave that place in search of food. Right, now this was one form of migration. You come back to Asia. Now many groups from Central Asia, they started migrating towards different parts of the world, because the Chinese in the very first century built walls preventing people from Central Asia from entering into China. The credit goes to a man called Shi Huangdi, and it was he who built the Great Wall of China. And not the present Great Wall. The present Great Wall was built sometime during the 13th and the 15th century, and the walls were wide and even a road was maintained. This happened during the 13th and 14th century. I'm talking about Shi Huangdi, who built it around the 2nd century BC. So now the Chinese were trying to prevent people from Central Asia from reaching their country. So nations were building walls. Currently, the United States is building a wall in Mexico, which President Donald Trump calls Big Beautiful Wall. He wants to prevent people from the Latin American countries from entering the United States of America. And he calls all those immigrants undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants as stone cold criminals. That's the term which he uses to refer to all these immigrants who come from Latin American countries, especially from Honduras, Guatemala, and even from Mexico. Okay. So now people were building walls, trying to prevent them. Then there were national barriers which acted as a deterrent for many of the potential migrants. So migration took place throughout human history. Now, come back to the migrant problem that we face today in our country. I'll be going back and forth in history and relating this to the issue of movement of people. So when India started becoming a very industrialized nation, somewhere in the 1980s, and when it followed, you could see people migrating within the nation from one region to the other. Now, this is not something new. Even before independence, also migration took place. For instance, when the British started their tea gardens or tea estates in Assam, people from other parts of the country in search of jobs, they went to Assam. And they came from Bengal. the United Bengal, the former Bengal. So they went in large numbers and they went and settled down in Assam. If you happen to read Mulkraj Anand's novel, Two Leaves and a Bud, he tells the story of people moving from one part of the country to another. So now it started when the British started unifying our nation under one administrative head. People were given the liberty to move from one part of the country to another part of the country in search of jobs, or they wanted this labor, the British wanted this labor force to generate wealth and to fill their coffers. So it happened within this country. I will come to that a little later. So as you examine the movement of people, I'll again go to Europe and then come back to India. So I told you about people migrating to the United States of America. The labor, the word that I use, the labor force, they required to develop the plantations in the United States of America, especially the cotton plantations and the tobacco plantation. They needed a labor force, and it was well nigh impossible for them to hire whites or precisely the Caucasians as laborers. So the second best alternative was to bring the labor force from outside. And the slave trade, that's how the slave trade began. This was a kind of a forced migration. Now, look at voluntary migration and forced migration. These men and women, they were taken from Africa and they were sold in slave markets. And the Portuguese, the French, and the British, they were in the forefront. They built special ships, which they called the galleons, especially it's a three-masted ship, so that they could transfer a heavy load of slaves to America. So this was a forced migration, and people went to America as slaves. You know, I do not know how many of you remember this famous song by this popular singer Bob Marley. You know, in that song, Buffalo Soldier, right? It's a very beautiful song. In that song, the lines go like, the lines go like this: Buffalo Soldier, stolen from Africa, brought to America, fighting on arrival, fighting for survival. You know, very moving song. Even today, they fight for their survival. So, fighting on arrival and fighting for survival. I'm quoting a very popular song, Buffalo Soldier, by Bob Marley. So, it tells you how people were forcibly taken to America and sold in the slave markets like cattle, like animals. So, this was also another form of migration. Then I should also be telling you this. This is what we call migration from Europe to different parts of the world. I told you about America. And people from Spain and Portugal, they started migrating to South America, what we call Latino nations today, Latin American countries. And the Spanish and the Portuguese, they started moving towards South America. So when they went there, they took their culture also with them. I'll be talking about it shortly and how it produced a certain form of literature. So now then, when the sea route was discovered for Australia in 1770 by Captain Cook, the very first ship in 1778, it arrived in what they call Botany Bay, that is near Sydney today, with criminals and convicts. And it became a penal colony. And Australia itself became a penal colony, including Tasmania, which is called Van Diemen's Land, a penal colony. So all the social rejects, criminals and convicts, they were transported to a country like Australia. This was also a form of migration, a form of movement. So now before the end of 18th century, you would find there was a large scale migration. Now, I want you to go back in time to the Middle Ages, between the 10th century and 15th century. Now, what happened? This was also an age of conquest, an age of invasion. You know the history of India, how people came from outside, how people came from the central regions of the world. And you had this invasion which happened almost till the beginning of the 16th century. The Middle Ages were known for this movement from the Mongolian border to Central Asia and to other parts of the world. So you hear the story of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, and many others. Say, for instance, at that time, people were very fond of horses. Now, what facilitated this movement of people? They didn't walk, they didn't move by taking their cattle, but rather they had this mobility, freedom of mobility, and they were crossing the central the plateau and the steppe region on fast-moving horses. So their life depended on their horses, and all those hardy and able-bodied men who thought of themselves as conquerors and invaders. They were very brutal, and they were on their horseback for most of their time, because back in their home, they had nothing to eat, that nothing was growing, and they were looking for food and pasturage, and they kept on extending their boundaries. So during the Middle Ages, you would come across even a mythical figure, the mythical figure of a centaur. That is the body of a horse and a human face. So now, if you try to recollect a centaur, you know how it looks like. Human front part, and the back, it is a horse. So it is a kind of a condensation, to use a Freudian term, where you cannot separate the person from the animal. They both are one. It's an image of people who were moving, who were migrating, centaur, C-E-N-T-A-U-R. Now, look at this. So people had this mythical figure of centaur, and these hordes were there, and they were moving in different parts of the world. And around this time, the Great China Wall was built, and China protected itself from outsiders, right? Whereas the other nations lay bare, and they were not able to protect themselves. And this was also one form of migration, exodus from one region to another. And there are communities, what we call sedentary communities, basically agricultural communities, which invested heavily on agriculture and which believed in a communitarian setup, and they have their families, homes, and a sedentary life. And this life was frequently disturbed by such people and by such invaders, by such, because they never had strict national boundaries in those days. Those boundaries were redrawn very often. And what you have in summer, you may not have that for your winter. So boundaries kept changing. And this form of a nomadic life, so, is not new. It was there during the Middle Ages, and it happened during the later centuries, and we continue to have such a nomadic life even in modern times, made possible by our globalization and industrialization. Okay, so now come back. Now, when people started migrating in many parts of the world, facilitated by colonialists, facilitated by capitalist entrepreneurs, facilitated by even university students, and facilitated by other forces, what we simply call historical forces, which facilitated people and ensured. So I told you about slavery. So when slavery was abolished in England in 1833, And later in America in 1865, they still needed a labor force, a workforce to work in their fields and in plantations. So in the place of slavery, there came another system which we call indentured labor system. Indentured labor. Now here is something voluntary. You go and offer yourself as a laborer, signing a contract. And in this contract, you assure your hirer or your employer that you would work for him for 5 years, for food, for shelter, and you would work for him. So this indentured labor system came into force sometime after 1830s, right? And this became prevalent. So the British took even Indians. See, that's how the forefathers of V.S. Naipaul, they migrated to Trinidad in the West Indies. So indentured labor, and many people from the southern part, especially from Tamil Nadu, from Andhra Pradesh, and some parts of Kerala, they migrated to places like Sri Lanka, Singapore, and in Malaysia, and also to Burma. At least these were the Southeast Asian nations to which they went as indentured laborers. Some of them went even as far as a country like Fiji. So now indentured labor system came into force, and all this happened because of famine. The famine in Dharmaburi district, the famine in Ramanathapuram district, which forced a good number of them to migrate and go to Sri Lanka and work in tea gardens, or go to Malaysia and work in rubber plantations, and go to Singapore. And of course, they built a city like Singapore. Then they went to Malaysia, Burma, and they worked in what we call a teak industry, right? So now indentured laborers, this was also movement of people in search of jobs so that they could take care of their livelihood. Families also migrated along with them. And right, as people also went to South Africa, another important nation, right? People from India. For a long time, certain castes and communities, they refrained themselves from migrating for the simple reason, if they crossed the waters, they would lose their caste identities, which proved to be a great deterrent for many of those folks to move outside the country. So, but later, when people migrated from Gujarat and parts of Maharashtra to Eastern Africa, they were all traders. They all belonged to trading communities. They went to countries like Kenya. They went to countries like Tanzania, Uganda, and they established their shops, so to speak. And this was a significant migration. So migration has been happening all through human history. And that is how, that is why people claim there is nothing called racial purity. Racial purity itself is a myth. What we have today is nothing but a racial bounty. We have mixed races living across the world. This was an important movement, but something terrible happened in our own nation. This was in 1947 when the partition took place. Now, along with the partition came exodus, mass migration of people in our own Indian subcontinent. But this was a very brutal, bloody, and no one knows how many people perished. So on either side, both Hindus and Muslims, they died. And this was something that, the partition was something that triggered a brutal, or what we call the barbaric forces within us. So, and people were crossing from India into Pakistan, from Pakistan into India. No one knows how many people died, but people say nearly 5 million to 10 million, that is nearly 1 crore people migrated on either side. No one knows the number, and it generated a kind of a literature, what we call partition literature. Now, those who are familiar with let us say Kushwant Singh or Batsi Sidhwa of Pakistan, or many of these writers, I'm not going into what they wrote, but they wrote something very significant, something poignant, bordering on human emotions and the loss, pain that this partition triggered, this movement of people triggered. I just want to quote this writer who migrated from India to Pakistan. His name is Sadat Hasan Manto. Now, Sadat Hasan Manto, basically a Kashmiri who lived in Mumbai, who moved from Kashmir to Mumbai, and he worked with Bombay's film industry. Then he was in Delhi as a journalist. He even worked for All India Radio, Delhi, before he chose to migrate to Pakistan. And he has written some of these human stories. And I wish you could read something like Toba Tek Singh, for instance. Toba Tek Singh is a place in Pakistan, and it's the name of a village. And here is a character called Bishan Singh. Those who have read the story, those who are familiar with the story, you know how finally Toba Tek Singh lies in a no man's land because he has been forcibly evicted from his home in Pakistan, and they tell him to go to India, and he doesn't understand why he has been asked to move, whereas Indian border is just a few kilometers away. Why he has to leave his home, why he has to leave his homestead, he doesn't understand. It's a very story which is heart-wrenching, which is really heart-rending. Another story I want you to read is The Return. It's titled Koldo. A very moving story which really moved me to tears. This is about a rape survivor. This is about a young woman by name Shakina and her father Sirajuddin. Now, they migrate from India to Pakistan, but this girl gets lost, and search groups are sent after her. Even volunteers come forward to search for her. And before they return the girl to their father, the girl has been repeatedly raped. It's a very poignant tale of a young woman, right? So now I'm not going to continue the story. You go and read the story yourself. And very emotionally moving tales of partition. Now, so every time people migrate, people move, they have a story to tell. In this case, a very bloody story, I would say. Pardon my expression. It's a bloody story. And the partition tales, it promoted or it gave us a kind of literature which we call partition literature. Okay, now go back to the United States of America. The slaves, when they went to America, they had to tell the story, which we call slave narratives. Now, what are these slave narratives? The slaves choose to tell their own story, and they were, remember, they were all what we call illiterate. So how do they tell the story? They tell the stories through songs and through the vaudeville shows. For instance, Phyllis Wheatley, you must have heard of her, and she is recorded as the first slave narrator. But Phyllis Wheatley had a very interesting patronage. She lived in her master's home. And when she lived in her master's home, she was given good education, and she went on to write good pieces of poems. So she was a literate woman. Whereas, if you listen to someone like a Sojourner Truth, now Sojourner Truth was this woman who gave her autobiography. This is narrative of Sojourner Truth. Well, she dictated her autobiography. She was a very powerful speaker, and she mixed religion, politics, culture, and she was giving very impressive speeches, which we call slave narrative. So I can give you a long list of slave narratives, and if you really want to know, you read Alex Haley's The Roots, which was also made into a TV serial. And in Alex Haley's The Roots, you come across 4 generations of slaves and their modern day life. Very very human, and it tells you about the progress in the life of the slaves. Okay, so then there were abolitionists who stood up against slavery, and they wrote their novels. For instance, when Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she wrote her Uncle Tom's Cabin, a very, very moving tale, a moving story. This explores the relationship between a young white girl and a very old African-American slave, Uncle Tom. Later, Uncle Tom has become a figure for all those old slaves who are in white homes taking care of their kids. Uncle Tom, a very lovable figure. Now, this figure is totally different from the Jim Crow figure of an African American. So, now, when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, that proved to be the trigger. It is a thesis novel, an abolitionist novel. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe. You know, Abraham Lincoln was 6 feet 3 or 4 inches, whereas she was a diminutive figure, a very short woman. And it seems Abraham Lincoln quipped like this: "Are you the little woman who brought about this great war? Are you the little woman who brought about this great war?" Now, why am I sharing this with you? This is one form of literature where it talks about the people's movement, right? And their movement from one part of the world to another part of the world, where they saw themselves becoming slaves and found themselves as emancipated slaves. So when the Emancipation Declaration was given in 1865, slavery was abolished, but the blacks were forced to fend for themselves. There was nothing for them. There was nothing for them, and they had to go and fend for themselves. The white majority population did not come to their rescue. So now I'll read out this small remark by one of the slaves. He says, right, "We were fed like pigs, bred like cows, whipped like horses, worked like mules, and when emancipation finally came, driven off like dogs. We were fed like pigs, bred like cows, whipped like horses, worked like mules, and when emancipation finally came, driven off like dogs." Now look at this. This was the condition of the people. They were scattered all over America. And now, before the Civil War, which happened between 1861 and 1865, many northern states, or states in the northern part of America, the Union states, they declared their states to be a free state. They were called free states. The Confederates, the southern states which protected slavery, they were called Confederates. You read this wonderful story in Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. I do not know how many of you have read this book, Gone with the Wind, or seen that film. You come across Scarlett O'Hara, an unforgettable character, and Rhett Butler, another important character, which tells you about the southern states which promoted slavery. Now, of late, you have been watching on your television screens how the statues of the Confederate leaders, they were pulled down, or they were getting pulled down. You must have watched this. And now remember, people were moving from the southern part of the United States to the northern part. So they call that the Underground Railroad. And Underground Railroad, look at this, and how they hitchhiked on railway wagons, how they got into this railway wagons and they migrated. They call that Underground Railroad. There was this lady called Harriet Tubman. Now, Harriet Tubman, she personally shepherded nearly 300 and odd African Americans from the south to the north. Then there was this interesting fellow, his name was Brown, who went and packed himself in a huge parcel and how he got himself parceled out of the southern part of the United States of America, and he got himself delivered in New York. It's a very interesting story. So you come across these stories. Now, Colin Whitehead, you must have heard of him. His novel, The Underground Railroad, which was published recently, which tells you the story of two characters, Cora and Caesar, and how they migrated, and how that Colson Whitehead, yeah, his The Underground Railroad, a very impressive story. And in this story, you come across this character by name Cora, and she also tells the story how her grandmother, right, and how her grandmother, her name is Ajari, Ajarry, how she was transported from Africa to from Africa to America. And there you come across an interesting story where she was transported in a ship, and where her relatives were transported in another Portuguese ship. But that Portuguese ship never made it to America. You know why? Because of plague. The whole ship was affected by plague. The crew and their entire human cargo perished because of plague. And when the ship went and anchored somewhere in the Caribbean islands, the authorities, they set fire to the whole ship because the ship was quarantined outside the Caribbean, one of the Caribbean islands, which she never knew of. So when she went to America, she thought the relatives were somewhere in America, and she was very hopeful of meeting them. Very tragic story. So you come across such stories, human stories. This is by Colson Whitehead. So I'll be telling you more stories, and as I narrate the human exodus from different parts of the world. So in recent memory, we'll come back to the recent memory. I'm going back and forth in history so that we can understand. You have the slave narratives. If you have the slave narratives in America, you have the convict narratives in Australia. So when the convicts, say some of them were convicts, criminals, they were transported. Sometimes innocent men were also branded as convicts, and they were transported to Australia. Now, look at this convict narrative. One of the earliest convict narratives written in 1813. The title of the work is Quintus Servington, a tale founded upon incidents of real occurrence. Let me read out the title for you again. Quintus Servington, a tale founded upon incidents of real occurrence. This was written by one Henry Savary. Henry Savary. So Henry Savary was a convict forger and debtor, man who was known for his forgery, and he was convicted and he was sent to Australia. And this is a convict narrative. And in Australia, it is different. Here, the labor force was mostly whites, the labor force. So the convicts, they were made to build towns, they were made to work in building towns, in mines, in abattoirs, or what we call slaughterhouses. And it was cheap labor, and sometimes it was free labor. Now, before they were manumitted, or before they were set free, and mostly they were set free in their old age, till then they had to work, and work. So another interesting tale was the story of Ralph Rascal. Now this is written by James Tucker sometime in 1940s. This is about a London thief, Ralph Rascal, and his convict days. And it tells you a beautiful story of his convict days in Australia, and his life with a gang of outlaws, and his encounter with the Aborigines. So that is by James Tucker, who wrote Ralph Rascal. Then in recent times, Marcus Clarke's melancholy masterpiece. Now, this is for the term of his natural life. This is a very, very sad story. This tells the story of a man by name Rufus Dawes, an innocent man who was unjustly dispossessed. He was exiled and he was brutalized, and his life in a prison and his suffering as a human being. So he talks of how Australia, the country itself, is a prison. You do not have to be locked in a particular place. How the whole continent itself is a prison. So now prison becomes a metaphor for Australia, the continent itself. So that metaphor continues in Patrick White's A Fringe of Leaves. I'm not going to tell you any of these tales, but this is all about movement of people from one part of the world to another part of the world. And they have a story to tell. So like this slave narratives, you have this convict narratives, right? Now, you have the whole concept of movement. Say, again, let me go back to America and tell you something. Say, in the year 1832, when Andrew Jackson was the president of the United States of America, he ordered the Cherokee Indians, as they were called, they were moved out of Georgia and they were forced to go to Oklahoma. Now, this is something like 800 miles or 1,250 kilometers. So there was a beautiful painting and even lots of writings on what happened during this mass evacuation of people. See, now this is one form of ethnic cleansing. We talk of this forced evacuation of people or forced removal of people, either by killing them or vacating them from one place to another. We call that ethnic cleansing. See, such an ethnic cleansing took place in Sri Lanka in the 1980s. I'll tell you something about that ethnic cleansing which happened in the parts where Tamils lived in large numbers. That happened in the 1980s, beginning from 1981. You have a Sri Lankan diaspora living in Canada. People moved en masse out of Sri Lanka. So they came to India. Then they went to Canada, right? This is also one form of ethnic cleansing. Recently, in the year 2017, when the Rohingyas were Muslims from Bangladesh who had migrated to Burma. They live in the northern part of Burma in a state called Rakhine. In that Rakhine state, say it happened sometime in August 25, 2017, say when there was an attack on the Burmese army or the Myanmarese army, they retaliated. Nearly 200 villages were burned down. People were evacuated. They were moved, and what's more, they even implanted explosives or mines, landmines on the escape routes. So many of them were blown up. And finally, when the Rohingyas arrived in Bangladesh, nearly 5 lakh people were uprooted. I'll tell you another story. All right, now this is about China. In the year 1959, I think on March 17, 1959, when the Dalai Lama came to India. So he was moved out of Tibet. Tibet as a nation ceased to exist. In 1959, he came with his followers, nearly 1 lakh followers of his. They came to India. They settled down in Himachal Pradesh in a place called Dharamshala, which we know. And they came down to the south. I do not know how many of you have heard of this Tibetan settlement in Karnataka. This is on the way from Bengaluru to Mysore. On the highway, there is a place called Bailakuppe, which I had visited when I was in Bangalore. And even I wrote an article in Times of India in 1989. This was about a Tibetan settlement in Karnataka. 1 lakh people, mostly Tibetan Buddhists. 6,400 monasteries were destroyed in Tibet when the Chinese occupying forces, when they invaded Tibet and they annexed Tibet and declared Tibet as part of their country. So now 6,400 monasteries were destroyed and they all came to India. This was also a migration, forced migration. So now let me go back to the American story. The American story of the Cherokee Indians getting uprooted. This happened in sometime in 1834 or something. They call that tears, Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears. And some people call it the Tears of Trail, right? So Trail of Tears. So when you march from one place to another, when you move from one place to another, and when you know for sure you are not going to come back to your native land, you are not going to return to your native place, it breaks your heart. It absolutely breaks your heart. So now these people were forcibly evicted from their lands, evicted from the places. You know, you look into history, such things happened. Say, I do not know how many of you have seen the Baha'i Temple in New Delhi. It's a very beautiful temple, the Baha'i Temple. Say, in India, the followers of Baha'u'llah, there are nearly 2 million people live in India. They came from Persia or they came from Iran. They were persecuted in Iran and they came to India, nearly 2 million people. The Parsis, they came to India many centuries before, right? So the story goes on. And now people see what we call a kind of an ethnic cleansing, that people were driven away from their native lands, right? And exodus, as we understand the term, right, is nothing but mass migration of people or movement of people from one place to another. And how many of you have read this story, Grapes of Wrath? I do not know, written by John Steinbeck. Now, this tells you again a story of movement of people within the United States of America because of famine. Right, when Oklahoma turned into a dust bowl, people started migrating from Oklahoma to California. And they thought they would go and pick fruits and they would get some jobs. And this tells you a very sad story of this family called Jode family. You have something like Pa Jode, Ma Jode, right, Grandpa Jode, and all those characters. Go and read that. It is all about internal displacement. Now, so it is displacement from one continent to other, displacement from one nation to other, displacement within a nation. All this happens. You know, we use the common term exodus. So now exodus can happen because of war, because of famine, and because of starvation, plague, even diseases that drove people from one region to another. See, now how this migration also affected people, I should be sharing this with you. When the Westerners went and implanted themselves in distant lands, say they went to America, they went to North America, they went to South America, they went to Australia, they went to Canada, they went to New Zealand. And what did they take along with themselves? Influenza, measles, whooping cough. The natives had absolutely no protection against any of these diseases. More than the wars these people conducted, the Westerners conducted, the war was an invisible one like this. They all died of measles, which was unheard of in America, which was unheard of in South America. See, especially in South America. Now, the South America always boasted of a rich culture, governance, and a system. For instance, the Mayans who live in Guatemala and the Aztecs who live in Mexico, then the Incas who live in Peru and Chile. They had absolutely no protection against these Western diseases, namely influenza. measles, and whooping cough. Later, smallpox also joined hands, and many of them perished. I'll tell you the story of New Zealand. The Maoris. The Maoris are a distinct group of people. They live in New Zealand. They they had their own culture. The Maoris then had their own culture. So when the Westerners went there, when the English people went there, they they signed an agreement with the British Queen. Of course, in the 1980s, the British Queen tendered an apology to what they did to the Maoris of New Zealand. And the Maoris, the Westerners had this contemptuous term for them, calling the Maori the dying race. Why? They didn't have to fight. They didn't have to shoot the Maoris. The Maoris died because of the pathogens. The pathogens they carried all the way from Europe to a distant land like New Zealand. See, very often when we talk about a movement, very often when we discuss something like Exodus, we talk about flow of cultural goods, flow of capital goods. Then some or other, we don't discuss the flow of pathogens from one part of the world to another. Look at the present day. The pathogens, they also flow in different directions. And that's what we have discovered recently, right? From its originary country, from China, it went to different parts of the world and people carried them. Now, this is also a flow, the flow of pathogens. Right, now, come back. And you have this interesting story, Grapes of Wrath, told by John Steinbeck. The book was banned for a long time because in the final scene, in a very, very moving scene where you don't have any food and a woman comes forward and she's a lactating mother and she comes forward to feed an old man with her milk, literally and figuratively, milk of human kindness flows from her. And she tries to save that old man by breastfeeding him. Very, very moving tale, Grapes of Wrath. So now as we discuss literature, as we discuss people, and as we discuss migration or movement, this is the literature of times like this. Now we have to recollect what happened in the past, what is happening now, what will happen in future. We can somehow or other speculate. Now let me come back. Now I told you about the Rohingyas and about the Sri Lankan Tamils and others. But you remember when people started migrating from Syria and from Iraq, so because of their internal conflicts, because of their internecine wars, there was a large-scale migration to Europe. And remember, many years ago, at least we saw this awful image of a 3-year-old boy. His name is Alan Kirby. And he was lying face down on a Turkish beach holding on to a toy, which moved and which jolted the conscience of people. See? Now, the kind of transcendence we are talking about, we have to transcend our narrow identities. We have to transcend our parochial thoughts. We have to transcend our narrow mentality. So we have to transcend our narrow identities, even to reach out to such people. So we have to transcend our gendered identities, our racialized identities. We have to even casteist identities, so that we can reach out to the suffering masses, to the suffering people. That's how Europe reacted. They allowed, Germany was the first country to open its doors to this Syrian refugees. So, and the refugee tide was such in the year 2016, nearly 720,000 people or 720,000 people migrated from Syria and from another conflict zone, Iraq and Libya. They migrated to Germany. But the number fell. The very next year, the number fell to only 2 lakhs. But now it is still a trickle. People still keep migrating from these 3 countries, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Now, coming back, it is not always a sad story, the migrant story. The migrants contribute to the wealth of their host nations too. So now let me tell you about this, how they contribute to the wealth of other nations. You must have heard of this H-1B visas, which are regularly issued by Americans. Now, who do they invite to their country? And who do they expect to come to their country? They expect highly skilled people. See, sometimes when we talk of these migrants and this labor force, we talk about unskilled laborers or unorganized laborers who come from unorganized sectors, and they have nothing, they have no one to defend them, and they have nothing to live for. No, I'm not talking about those people. We will discuss them also. But look at these people, these highly skilled laborers, and they go to countries. See, from India, lots and lots of people went to the Gulf states. Say, when in the 70s and 80s, there was the economy of most of the Gulf nations were built with the help of the migrant labor force that went from India, chiefly from Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and from Maharashtra and certain regions. They all migrated to the Gulf nations. Now, look at a country like Dubai. Now, Dubai is a very, very rich country now, and this is a society. Here they had created an affluent society. And this affluent society was created by migrants and their skilled labor. Look at a country like Japan. Say, Japan is also an affluent society, but that affluent society was created by natives. See, Japan never encourages migrant workforce. They don't import migrant workforce. They themselves work hard, and they have built such a strong economy. It's one of the most powerful nations in the world. They belong to Group 7, and it's an affluent society. Now look at an affluent society like Dubai, which was built by migrants, and affluent society like Japan, which was built by natives. Here lies the difference. So the migrants' contribution. I'll give you a small statistical detail. Say, migrants worldwide make 3% of the population. But I told you, the number is somewhere around 258 million people worldwide. They constitute 3% of the world population. But you know their contribution to the GDP, that is gross domestic product of the entire world, it is 9% of the world's GDP. And the remittances, that is the money they send back to their native homes, the money they send back to their countries of birth, it amounts to somewhere around $480 billion. What we call remittances. In the 1980s, we call them petrodollars, which came from these oil-rich nations or OPEC nations, oil and petroleum exporting countries. Then, in the form of American dollars or British pounds or euros, these remittances, they amount to $480 billion. Now, in a way, it helps what we call the bottom billion, as the economists call the bottom billion, that is people below the poverty line, to raise themselves above the poverty line because of these remittances. And all this is made possible by such migrants. So, but these migrants pose a problem. So in a country like America, they pose a problem, the Asian Americans, especially. How many of you have seen this film, Crazy Rich Asians? I do not know. If you have seen this film, you know how rich these migrants have become in their host countries and in their adopted countries. So this film tells you a beautiful story, Crazy Rich Asians. You watch that film, it's a Hollywood film. It tells you about the Chinese Asians, the Chinese Americans who live in America and other parts of eastern parts of the world. So now, the host countries, which is where most of the host countries, which is fair by a homogeneous culture, which talks about a homogeneous culture, because a homogeneous culture alone can produce values for them, or national values, as they call that. And they see such invasive cultures or invasive people or their invasive food habits or cultural products as deeply disturbing. So if you happen to read American literature, they created something like melting pot, and they created certain metaphors like melting pot. Now, melting pot is almost assimilationist. That is, when people come to your country, you absorb them and they get assimilated in your culture. And at the cost of their cultural inheritance. They are forced to forget their culture. They are made to become part of the culture. And it is a kind of a melting pot. Now, this did not work with people from Asia. It worked with people from Europe, from Eastern Europe, and from Russia, from Germany, from other parts of European nations. It worked. But it did not work with the Asians, or precisely with the Southeast Asian people. So they had this interesting metaphor called melting pot. Then they used something like a salad bowl. Another interesting metaphor, salad bowl. Now, in a salad bowl, you have fruits of different colors. It may be yellow, or it may be orange, or it may be white. So each one retains its own place and its identity and asserts its identity, a kind of a salad bowl. Then they had something called a patchwork quilt. Now, patchwork quilt, a quilt by which you cover yourself as you sleep. Now, it has a lot of patchwork, and they developed this concept of patchwork quilt. That is another interesting metaphor to define such communities in their midst. So ultimately, it boils down to a kind of a liberal multiculturalism. The Canadians, they used the whole concept of cultural mosaic. So Canada itself is a country formed by migrant people. At least 21% of people in Canada identified themselves as migrants. It has a very small population of 3 crores, like Australia, which has a small population of 3.2 crores or something. So now 21% of the population, they are migrants. They recent migrants. I'm talking about recent migrants. And remember, Canada was another country which opened its doors to all these migrants from Syria and from other countries. So they have the whole concept of cultural mosaic. So now nations try to define themselves by using such colorful metaphors, and they swear by an ideology called multiculturalism. Now remember, multiculturalism as such is polyvocal. It is heteroglottal. When I say polyvocal, heteroglottal, I'm basically anti-foundational. So if you read multicultural literature, now there are quite a good number of literature or literary pieces you can come across. So now multiculturalism has come to stay, but multiculturalism has to be reinvented every time, and you have to assert itself. And we cannot simply say it is a play of difference. Multiculturalism is nothing but play of difference, and it is not simply, as we term it, as accommodationist. It is not as easy as that. As we see, the African Americans, they have to repeatedly assert their rights. They have to repeatedly assert their place in a society, which says a society which swears by access, equity, and equal treatment. But even in such a society, this multiculturalist thoughts, this multiculturalist ideas have to be re-examined, have to be regenerated, so that it seeps into people's consciousness. Say, India as a country, we have this, we are a multicultural country for a very, very long time. There are so many cultures which coexist if not peacefully all the times, but we have this in our consciousness, the whole concept of Vasudeva Kudumbakam, as we call that, the world as one, Vasudeva Kudumbakam. And in Tamil, we have this beautiful slogan-like saying by Kaniyan Pungundrana, Yadum Ure, Yavarum Kelir. Yadum Ure, Yavarum Kelir. A wonderful definition for multiculturalism. So now this migrant people, these migrant communities, they accelerate the growth of multicultural thinking. So now this multicultural thinking, now people simply say sometimes it's nothing but a cosmopolitan thought, a cosmopolitan thinking. But as Swami Vivekananda says, it is not tolerance, it is acceptance. Now, I'm very happy about this term, acceptance. Now, tolerance is you may not like someone, in your heart of heart, you nurture this hatred, right? But still, you tolerate somebody. It's very much a negative term to me. But acceptance is accepting people as they are, what they stand for, what they believe in, the culture they have. So now that is called acceptance. So now this thought is there in our nation. It is there in our midst for a very long time. Okay, so now multiculturalism, I'm not saying that's the panacea for all this problems related to migration, because it is very difficult. There is something called core consciousness, our first consciousness. Even when people migrate to distant lands, to far-off countries, to far-off nations, there is always a longing for the life left behind, for the way of life left behind. And what is that way of life? No, that is your core consciousness. That is why people who migrate from India to other parts of the world, whether they are Hindus or Muslims or Christians, or even Sikhs or Jains or any number of religious affiliations they have, they always go back to their ancestral roots. Somehow or other, they cherish this first consciousness, our core consciousness. Okay, so the time is very short to discuss all this, but I want all of us to remember this is the time when we talk about people and migration of people. And 8 crore people in our country, they went as guest workers. Guest workers, Kerala calls them guest workers. They are their guests because many Keralites and Malayalis went as guest workers to the Gulf and other parts of the world. Guest workers, you are treated as guests, guests in our midst. But how did we send back the guests? It's time for, I think it was Dr. Jinnah or someone told us, I think Dr. Jinnah told us, this is a time for introspection. It is time for self-reflection, not for stock taking. It is time for self-reflection, how we treated them, right? When these people, these hapless people, with all their luggage and baggage and their children, when they wanted to rush back, because it is their core consciousness that I am a Bihari, right? That I am from Bengal, I am from Tamil Nadu, I am from Andhra Pradesh. I yearn to go back to my native place. In times like this, in times of trials like this, in times of tribulations like this, let me go back to my own people. Let me live in their midst. Let me die there in my native land. Now, this thought oppresses the mind of most of those people. They know for sure when they go back to their native, they are not going to find jobs. They are not going to get food. But why did they rush back? Because of this core consciousness. Let me go back and live in the midst of my own people. Let me die in my native land, not in a strange place, right? So, and this COVID-19 drove them back, but it augurs well for the nation. It augurs well for our economy, because migration is the economy. And people who migrate, they bring with them their labor, their hard work, which generates the wealth for a nation. So now Just a minute, I will finish. And uh, keep these things at the back of your mind. How we treat them, how we regard them. Say, at one point, people in the West, they even treated people, they called them computer coolies. This was a very derogatory term reserved for all our computer professionals that we exported. But the computer coolies who went there as computer coolies, now they were the technocrats. They were the ones who went as migrants, whether it was Sundar Pichai or Satyam Nadella or any of these people who head some of these very powerful business empires of the world. Perhaps they went as migrants. They went as migrants, but they made their host country feel proud because of their contribution to the world at large. So let's not take this concept of migrancy, this notion of moving from one place to another as something light. Economies grow and economies are built by such migrant population. And it may be a brain drain for one country, and it may be a brain gain for another country. But it is no longer a brain drain or brain gain for any nation. When we talk of a global economy, when we talk of because all our lives are interconnected. It is the web of life. That's what Dr. Ganesh was talking about. All our lives are interrelated. We have been brought together. Even in our suffering, we have been brought together. Okay? And we have to develop this thought of world as one, right? And you may think globally, right? But you have to act locally. That is why when the Prime Minister talked about autarky. Now, Atmanirbhar, yeah, that was the term used by our Finance Minister. Self-reliance. You do not rely on imported goods. In economics, they call that autarky, A-U-T-A-R-K-Y. That is self-sufficiency. With our own labor force, with our own talent, with our own, with the skills of our own people, we can build a powerful nation, a powerful country. And we should encourage internal migration, movement of people from one part of our country to another part. And after all, we take this solemn vow, all Indians are our brothers and sisters. The moment we transcend the thought, I am different, I am unique, I am superior. And when I start thinking that we are all one, and when we think this is one great nation we have to build, which will be a powerful nation in the comity of nations of the world. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Benet. You took us from migration to multiculturalism. And well, it's not as simplistic as that, but you have covered the entire spectrum and the entire gamut. In fact, there was a question which I think is, which I would say is an observation. Says, sir, how do you distinguish between exodus, migration, exile, displacement, transmigration, and transnationalism? I think that's more of a comment than a question. I think sir has covered all these terms, and it's in that term exodus, it's a movement of people. And I also like to share that one of the viewers asked me, you know, your lecture series has a lot of philosophy, sociology, and history. How much of literature is it? So I had to explain to that person that we have two schools of thought, art for art's sake and art for life's sake. And our lecture series can probably come in that art for life's sake approach. And also reminds me of my undergraduate program at Women's Christian College, where History of English Literature was titled life and literature. So this is what we have been looking at in the past 4 days, life and literature. And I thank you, sir, for teaching us to venerate the migrant and to see that we are all evolving. We are all evolving, and COVID-19 is truly transnational. So, and it has spurred interest in transnational studies in one sense. So I invite participants to ask questions if you have any.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, ma'am.
This is Ashwini from University of Madras.
Yeah.
I have a question, sir.
Yeah.
Y.B. Satyanarayana, in his book My Father Balaya, has talked about too many transfers of his father within the state. My question is, how do you perceive this? It is internal migration, or sorry, it is a forced migration or an internal displacement.
No.
Thank you.
See, there is something called voluntary migration also. Sometimes because of political reasons, people migrate, and say you have the whole concept of green pasture, right? A better job, a better opportunity. That is what we call voluntary migration. Now, voluntary migration is you go for education as a student, as a tourist sometimes, right? That is only for a short term. You go as a tourist, right? Then you return to your home country. See, but when you go as a student, then you take up a job in a country, you choose to settle down. Now, that is a voluntary migration. No one forces you to move. But see, in the 1990s, there was a huge debate in our country about the brain drain. How our best minds from IITs and Indian Institute of Science and higher education institutions of India, we train them, we give them education. But they all migrate to the West. And all their knowledge and all their intelligence, they go into building a very affluent society in the West. But some or other, they are not found to be useful to our own country. But later they found out these people, the remittances I was talking about, the money they sent back to India, which helped them to develop the local economy. Right, Kerala became a very affluent state because of the petrodollars and the money sent. And even Tamil Nadu and the other, most of the people went from all over the country. And my answer is this, very simple. Forced migration is different. Say, sometimes it is not humanly forced. In recent times, it's a disease, a pathogen has forced us to move from one place to another. Okay, so my answer is this. When people are migratory, this is a socio-historical condition of humanity all through the ages. So migration is not a new phenomenon, and it has been happening throughout human history. And today, it has become a part of our public debate or our national narrative. That's all. Anyone?
So, good morning, sir. Am I audible?
What is that?
Sir, good morning, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, but you have to tone down the volume and talk, please. It's too loud.
Is it okay now, sir?
No, even tone down a bit.
Okay, sir. Greetings, sir. This is Senyavel Parivel from Queen Mary's College. And I can't restrain myself from saying that you from the land of Rockford have really rocked the session. And my question is, when migrant laborers actually come over to various regions, especially for working, native people of that region always consider them to be stealing the jobs of the natives. That is my first question. And second question is, when speaking about people migrating from their native regions to other countries, especially like Syrian refugees having fled their nation and found refuge in France, and Sri Lankan refugees having found refuge in Germany, Canada. They have fled the dangers in their nation, and they have actually sought life in new countries, and they are coming out like shining stars. So why are we always focusing on the negative side of migration? There is so much of positive aspects also.
Yeah, you are right. That's what precisely I'm trying to drive home. Saying migration is a human condition. Say, I'll give you a local example. In the last 15 or 20 years or so, there are quite a lot of people from northeastern states of our country. They have migrated to interior parts of India. They have come down to Bangalore, even Delhi, and to parts of Kerala and Tamil Nadu and so on. You know what happened? They were all skilled. They were highly educated and well-trained people. And they have come down here and they have integrated well with our nation. See, the militancy that was there in the northeastern states, it had gone down because poverty was removed from their midst, because of their remittances, because of their education. They were admitted in schools and colleges across the country. So it provided them with the education. It provided them jobs. As a result, these northeastern states have become peaceful, relatively peaceful in recent times, and they have integrated well with mainland India. So now, as you suggested, they move. See, we are not. We are talking about people who are without skills who try to migrate. Only they find problems. Say, especially when people migrate from Honduras, Guatemala, and when they want to enter into the United States of America, they are not skilled laborers. They are not educated people. Many of them are illiterates, poor peasants from Honduras. And the Americans say no to these people. They prevent these people from entering into their country because according to them, these people will be a drain on their national resources. Because once they enter the country, they can enjoy the welfare benefits of that country. And no nation wants to spend money on a population that enters the country who is not at all productive in any manner. And they get free doles and largesse, and they remain as refugees in asylums. And this no country wants to happen. You are welcome as either as a refugee or as an asylum seeker, provided you contribute to the economy of the host nation. That's the argument. So now, what happens to these poor people who are not at all educated, who are not at all skilled? What happens to these people? They cannot join the society because their social models are different in these nations, and you cannot become part of their society, and you cannot contribute anything to that society. That hinges the issue. Hope I have answered you partially, if not fully. Any other question?
We have, it's 10:11. So being the last day, we've taken a little more time. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the 4 resource persons. We've had such wonderful deliberations, thought-provoking, and most of all, it has, I believe, been a very humanizing influence. And if really our call as professors is to create a knowledge society, I think we have achieved that in some measure with touching base with history and geopolitics to understand COVID-19. So I wholeheartedly thank Dr. Rufus for his address on existentialism and for teaching us to engage with the human predicament so that we can leverage our seemingly cyclic existence to make life more meaningful on a day-to-day basis. Dr. Jinnah, thank you so much for that plethora of reading and for showing us that we need to introspect and that we need to move on from homeostasis. Dr. Ganesh, for helping us to look at ourselves in the multiverse and nudging us to realize that all knowledge is transcendence. Dr. Benet for taking us through Exodus in different parts of the world and helping us to see, though not in a kind of facile optimism, that sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. That good, there has been good that has come out of migration in the long run, and that we are evolving, the world is evolving. So I'd like to close our session with thanks to all the participants and for all those who have given your feedback, your warm wishes, you have expressed your desire to be connected with us, and you look forward to conferences and seminars that we are going to organize in future. So I just like, and I was thinking that, at COVID-19, many of the songs of the 80s, like We Are the World, Heal the World, so relevant today. And so I'd like to wrap up our deliberations for the day with the lyrics of We Are the World. I will read them to you. There comes a time when we heed a certain call, when the world must come together as one. There are people dying. Oh, and it's time to lend a hand, the greatest gift of all. We can't go on pretending day by day that someone somewhere soon make a change. We're all part of God's great big family, and the truth, love is all we need. We are the world. So thank you, friends, for being with us for all 4 days. I thank all the resource persons. I thank my colleagues at the Department of English. I thank the principal of my college and all the well-wishers we have at Queen Mary's. And with this, we sign off and wish you all the best. We pray for your safety, your health, and your purpose in life. Thank you.
Hello.